Introduction by Peter Linebaugh. Thomas Paine. Where liberty is, there is my country, declared Benjamin Franklin. To which Thomas Paine replied, where is not liberty, there is mine. Tom Paine was a worker and commoner. He spoke and wrote from a particular experience, that of an English artisan at the onset of industrialization. He was, too, a planetary revolutionary. Indeed, he helped give meaning to the term, and as such, his writing is hugely significant for the 21st century. If we were to compare him to any contemporary figure, it would be Che Guevara. He asserted aspiration, possibility, the unheard of. He breathed the warmth of human agency to frigid hierarchies of power. The phrase world revolutionary might have several meanings. A sailor of the seven seas, a scientist of the universal mind, a philosopher in the Republic of Letters, a journeyman on the move. Rachel Corrie in Palestine, Ben Linder in Nicaragua, Brad Will in Oaxaca, those from the USA who step forth onto the world stage at places of maximum hope in the class struggle, express his spirit. As with Guevara or Jose Marti, he too struggled within the belly of the beast. He likened the British Empire to Jonah's whale. These are the times that try men's souls, he wrote. His own soul was divided, so has been his legacy. The age of Paine, as John Adams called it, was contradictory, like any other individual or historical age. While he gave voice to the age, he would bend, if not kneel, to power. Power and empire have claimed him as one of their own. He has been quoted by American presidents, from Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama, who would not name him. A prevailing view is that he was only an American patriot, the nation. Another, that he was chiefly a citizen of the Republic. He defended private property and wrote on behalf of banking. His pamphlet, Common Sense, elucidated and called for revolution in America. Rights of Man defended revolution in England and France, constituting it upon popular sovereignty. As a patriot, as a citizen, as a populist, was Paine not an adjunct to the bourgeois revolution? We must take a fresh look. If Paine was these things, he was also an outlaw, a traitor, an alien, a felon. He died forlorn. His funeral in 1809, attended by a Frenchwoman, her two sons, some Irishmen, and two African Americans. In relation to power, Paine's life and thought was also divided. He took part in 3 attempts at revolution. In America and France it succeeded, while in Britain it failed. He was a class-conscious man, sensitive to the differences of power and money. He wrote and spoke for the common people. You see this in his first major writing, which is about the central capitalist relation, the wage. You see it also in his last major writing, which is about commoning, the case of the officers of excise. Denounced the relations of money and wages, while agrarian justice called for social reparations for class injustice. It is between these two major concerns that we place Paine's concepts of revolution and constitution. Paine lived during times of industrial revolution, commercial expansion, urbanization, and population growth. Behind these sclerotic phrases, so characteristic of the ideology of the Cold War, were the Atlantic-wide transformations of the class relations of capitalism, whose legacy endures to this day. The factory proletariat propelled the machines of industry. The slave plantation of the West Indies and the plundered indigenous peoples provided the commerce. The young, the unemployed, and the criminalized peopled the towns. The separate public and domestic spheres of women's endeavor reproduced the population on an enlarged scale. The working class was thus composed of waged artisans, criminalized unemployed, unwaged domestic workers as mothers and wives, slaves, and the indigenous and colonized. We tend to think of communism and capitalism as incompatible, but Paine did not think in such terms, which were still, to quote his great antagonist, Edmund Burke, in the gristle. That is, not yet well defined or full bodied. In preparing this introduction, I have found fresh evidence of commoning and its continuity in English history, whose significance has been neglected in Paine's scholarship. I have found it in the landscape of Paine's childhood and formative years, his ancestry, and his experience. This evidence shows us that Paine came from and belonged to a long English anti capitalist tradition. Moreover, it helps us understand the tasks of revolution and constitution in the 21st century. Landscape and commons. Thomas Paine was born in 1737 in a small corner of East Anglia, Thetford, a small town in the flint-rich, sandy heath Brecklands. His mother, Frances Coke, was an Anglican and the daughter of an attorney. Joseph, his father, was a staymaker or corset maker, the owner of a small holding and a Quaker. Together they formed a domestic compromise between established religion and historic dissent. The two forces, Anglican and Puritan, that collided during the English Revolution, 1640 to 1660. As a Quaker, Joseph was, quote, no respecter of persons, unquote. That is, he believed in equality, exactly what Voltaire admired in the Quakers. Yet for Thomas, his baptism, his marriage, and his funeral were all occasions of religious carpings and cavils. The landscape of Tom Paine's childhood world was the product of apparent capitalist triumph. The countryside had been enclosed, privatized. The country's bodies were bound and the people's voices gagged by, in Blake's eloquent phrase, mind-forged manacles. In consequence, Paine, as an individual, suffered from a kind of social trauma which repressed historical memory. This memory began to find release in 1774, when at the age of 37, and by all conventional standards, a failure in both love and money, he left England for North America, where he found his voice in an extraordinary revolutionary career. The Brecklands was beautiful with heart cease, cypress, spurge, spiked speedwell, grape hyacinth, wild asparagus, and the blue of vipers, bugloss, which provided spectacular color, surpassing in splendor anything that can be imagined. In the opinion of Paine's contemporary, the scientific botanist Carl Linnaeus, engrossment, emparkment, and enclosure had been at work for many centuries, and a map of the deserted villages of Norfolk shows a decided concentration in the Brecklands. But the region had been producing loose and wandering people since the 16th century. Perhaps this explains why the region became a symbol of liberty, in Oliver Rackham's words, or why the gentry was afflicted with ericophobia, or the fear of the heath. The soil was too sandy for the improvement that Norfolk was famous for among 18th century agribusinessmen. The heather and bracken in the great sweeps of sandy landscape provided raw materials of domestic life, fuel, fodder, thatch, and the ingredients of rural medicine. If enclosure and engrossment could not make the sandy desolation into fenced fields of agribusiness, then the emparkment and warrening would restrict the ecology into a partial hunting preserve for the privileged. The Duke of Grafton, who ruled Thetford from his estate at Euston, north of London, led the enclosure movement in the Brecklands during the 1780s. He had brought into cultivation extensive acreage that had previously been rough grazing common lands. He was a founding member of the Board of Agriculture in 1793. He ran a renowned stables and kennels, and the views landscaped by Capability Brown at Euston were admired by the ladies of England. This cold, sullen, and profligate contemporary of Paine was basically the ruler of Thetford. He managed to pass the Thetford Enclosure Act of 1804, in the process privatizing 5,616 acres and denying public access to 80% of the borough. A couple of months after Thomas was born, his father was made free of the town. That is, he joined its oligarchy. The accompanying privileges, though, were disappointing and amounted to little more than the right of pasturage on the commons. At about the same time, the great Norfolk historian Francis Blomefield records that a sturgeon was taken in the paper mill pond. The paper mill pond, 7 feet long and weighing 13 stone, 10 pounds. The fact is that while the birds of the air and the fish of the sea were thought to be God's creatures, their habitat was fast being privatized, and such creatures were deliberately bred in a type of semi-domesticated animal husbandry in the fish ponds and dovecotes and deer parks of the enclosing gentry. Around Thetford, rabbits were bred in the thousands, and woe betide the poacher who violated free warren, as the landlord's exclusive right was paradoxically termed. Rabbits had come to England with William the Conqueror. The early 18th century had seen an increase in commercial warrens providing fare to the London food markets and fur for felt hat manufacture. After the First World War, a local farm worker said they'd let you take a rabbit or two, for instance. Before 1914, if you'd caught a rabbit, my God, the world would have come to an end. Poaching had become a serious criminal offense. Its criminalization was an especially humiliating form of destroying the subsistence commons, and Paine had no doubt where the blame for it lay. Writing in 1792, he got straight to the point. Had there been a House of Fathers and not a House of Lords, there had been no game laws. Indeed, in one of the first acts of the independent USA, an alliance of backwoodsmen, artisans, and militiamen provided in the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 the right to fowl and hunt on their own land and on all other lands not enclosed. The Brex was renowned for more than its horns. Then, as now, it is the name for the flint-strewn open fields locally known as the wilderness. At its heart is Grimes Graves, the Neolithic flint mining galleries of 5 millennia past. The sound of the flint knapper's clear, precise tapping, quartering, flaking, and napping are the stages of ever finer shaping of flints, filled the village of Brandon, 5 miles from Thetford. Paine's prose is like this quartz, hard, crystalline, and perdurable. It has a glass-like glittering sheen. The palaces of kings are built on the ruins of the bowers of paradise. The comparison can be taken a step further. Flint had been essential to the arms industry since Neolithic times, used for arrowheads, axes, and spear points, and in Paine's era for guns. When the flint was struck against steel, the frisson, a spark was emitted that ignited the powder in the pan, whose explosion propelled the bullet down the smooth-bored musket, the Brown Bess of the American Revolution. From a small spark kindled in America, a flame has arisen not to be extinguished. Literally so, inasmuch as the British used black flints, which the Americans also preferred. When a shortage of flints humbled effective firepower in 1776, early in the war, the Second Continental Congress received a huge correspondence regarding flints. The Americans discovered black flints at Ticonderoga and sent 30,000 specimens to Washington. The shot, heard round the world, was detonated by Breck's flint, while flint and steel were the techniques of the imperial hunt. Paine writes in Common Sense that freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. Brecklin's flints are scattered about the planet today, the scat of empire. Breck's rebels. Born a few miles east of Thetford, Francis Blomefield went to the same school as Paine and published the first volumes of his history around the time of Paine's birth. A transcriber of church memorials, a genealogist of lords of manors, a describer of coats of arms. Blomefield was not a remembrancer of popular memory, yet he acknowledged a long tradition of rebellion. Like Paine, Blomefield drew upon a common store of local knowledge. Andy Wood has shown the shared tradition of popular revolt from the 14th century onwards, revealing continuities in leadership and organization, in similar patterns of regional involvement, and finally in the very consciousness of the continuity. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, Kett's Rebellion of 1549, and the English Revolution of 1649 were part of social memory, as they were steps in the long commodification of land until England could be bought and sold. Blomefield writes of the revolt of 1381, when the peasants rose for equality in the commons. These were the outrageous doings of this county. The people of Thetford, Lynn, and Yarmouth assembled together and came and rested before Norwich, and as they came, caused every man to rise with them. Tom Paine knew this story well and tells it in Rights of Man, albeit very differently to Blomefield. Blomefield retrojected the charged political term levelers from the 18th century back to 1381, adding historical depth to his condemnation of the actual levelers, the radical Republican movement of the English Civil War that was brutally suppressed by Oliver Cromwell. About 2 centuries before Thomas Paine, the second camp of Kett's 1549 rebellion organized operations at Brandon and Thetford, stopping traffic on the River Ouse. OUSE. This camping time, or commotion time, was, as Blomefield told it, class war. They openly declared great hatred against all gentlemen, whom they maliciously accused of covetousness, pride, extortion, and oppression, practiced against their tenants and the common people, having thoroughly imbibed the wicked notions of the ancient levelers, they begin to put in execution their vile designs. About a century before Paine's birth, the vicar of Santon Down, a Breck's village, once totally buried beneath shifting sands, kept a diary from 1625 to 1642. In it, he criticized a Mr. Paine of Riddlesworth, 6 miles east of Thetford, when noting that men be disposed to speak the worst of state business and to nourish discontent, as if there were a false carriage in all these things, which, if it were so, what would a false heart rather see than an insurrection, a way whereunto these men prepare? Paine's mother's ancestor, George Charles Coke, was a Puritan, a supporter of Oliver Cromwell, a parliamentarian, a law reformer, a sequestrator of royalist livings, and a Commonwealth judge. 2 years after Charles I was beheaded in 1649, Coke published English Law, or a summary survey of the household of God on earth. English law evinces the class consciousness of revolutionary times. Justice, it stated, would be served by turning out all the rich men and setting the plowman to be their lord. In the 1640s, the levelers claimed that the land was theirs originally, not the property of the descendants of the Norman conquerors. Coke defined levelers as those advocating the forcible taking away the property of rich men, and distinguished at least 6 kinds of leveling. Those affected by individual suits at law were one kind. A second held that all estates should be cast into a common stock and divided equally on the grounds that the poor had an interest in the commonwealth as well as the rich. A third called for a perpetual community of goods against the insatiable thirst for riches to be governed by virtuous magistrates, thus avoiding indiscreet agitations and perturbations of state. A fourth was Christian communism, as one family. A fifth was unregulated when the floodgates of liberty were broken up. A sixth of equity and righteousness will be based on proportionate justice or progressive taxation. Coke finds leveling part of Satan's work, the snake in the garden, but it is not difficult to see allusions to actual world movements of the time by ranters, levelers, and diggers. The diggers, in the theory and practice of Gerard Winstanley, based their practice on the actuality of commoning, an argument which Coke attempted to dismiss by asserting that commons were the tenants' rights originally, not the poor's. In a subsequent work, Coke argued that custom, a form of commoning if not communism, is not to be admitted as law unless it is reasonable. We're used to thinking of the relation between the radical demands of the 1640s and of the 1790s in terms of voting and the franchise, because that was the theme of the Putney debates. The levelers celebrated gathering at Putney Church in 1649. The debate about subsistence and leveling in the 1790s as the debate of the 1640s continued. The several methods of wealth redistribution, the links with religion, the fear of disorder, the relation between custom and the commons. In 1740, when Paine was a toddler, Darth threatened starvation. So the people took appropriate measures, posting notices on bakers' doors in Norwich to force down the price of bread. Wheat at 16 shillings a comb, a dry measure of 4 bushels. This was the heralded taxation populaire of the French social history and the moral economy of English. The people assembled at the sound of horns, a hostile witness reported, purposing to visit the gentlemen and farmers in the neighboring villages, in order to extort money, strong ale, and etc. from them. At many places where the generosity of people answered not to their expectation, 'tis said they showed their resentment by treading down the corn in the fields. This method of price regulation persisted in Brandon when, in 1816, 200 women and boys shouted, "Cheap bread, a cheap loaf, and provisions cheaper," and a woman submitted the demands on a paper, "Bread or blood in Brandon this day." Despite the threat of dragoons, the women kept the price down. Thomas Paine of Thetford belonged to an unbroken tradition of rebellion. The worker. In the early 1960s, when jets were replacing ocean liners as the preferred mode of transportation for academics, Professor W. W. Rostow compared the changes in mid 18th century capitalism to an airplane takeoff. Agriculture products, exports, imports, banking, manufacturers, and population suddenly boomed, flying into the clear blue skies of self-sustaining economic growth. Adam Smith's genius in The Wealth of Nations was to note that these changes originated in that despised, neglected arena, the division of labor and production. The botanical specimens, the zoological order, the mineral layers underground, as well as human manufactured products had become, or were rapidly becoming, commodities. Both raw materials and tools of production could be exchanged with one another and against money. This glory, the market, is the precondition of capitalism, whose essence was and remains the exploitation of labor, because labor too became commodified in the marriage market, the slave auction, and the labor market of wages. In the 20th century, people of color, women, and indigenous people were at the center of struggles against ideologies which attained their modern form during Paine's lifetime. The ideologies propounding white supremacy, the separate spheres of patriarchy, and the stadial inevitability of the extinction of indigenous people helped to produce the structures of modernity. The global south, feminism, and deep time are notions in the 21st century which were achieved only through these struggles. As a worker, Tom Paine gained experience in exploitation in the sexual markets, in military expeditions, and in revenue collection. As a corset maker, he witnessed the spirit of vanity. As a sailor aboard a privateer, he absorbed the spirit of plunder, and as an officer in the excise, he suffered from the spirit of fraud. One craft produced garments of erotic allure, the other prowled in military adventures, and the last sunk him directly in the corruptions of the mercantilist state. Each might be said to serve a social function of modernity: state sanctioned marriage, imperialist war, and state taxation. Paine's introduction to corset making came in 1750, when he was removed from Thetford Grammar School at the age of 13 and apprenticed to his father. Over the next 7 years, Thomas Paine learned to make corsets. Historians have described him simply as an artisan and inquired no further. His enemies in the 1790s made fun of him as a corset maker, in a way both snobbish and misogynist. Originally a garment with protective and orthopedic purposes, the corset had become, by the mid 17th century, a garment to mold a woman's body, flattening the stomach, straightening the back, in conformity with ruling concepts of female beauty and with upper class deportment. Epoma is the ballet term. From around 1650, whale fins, boiled, cut, split, and sliced, replaced wood and steel as stays, the elements of rigidity in the manufacture of the corset, or little body. 100 years later, when Paine took up the craft, the corset had been altered to give prominence to the breasts. Radiating transverse strips for the stays were added to the traditional pattern of stiffening and molding, emphasizing curves. A contemporary situated this trade in the Atlantic economy, comparing the body to enclosures of land and treating it as a commodity. They discover to us, indeed, a sample of what we wish to purchase, yet serve as a fence to keep us at an awful distance. They encourage the consumption of our manufactures in a prodigious degree, and the great demand we have for whalebone renders them truly beneficial to our allies, the Dutch. In short, they are public good. The market was enlarging. Servant maids accepted the cast-off corsets of their employers as one of their perquisites, and the corset ceased to be the exclusive dress of the upper class. With the expansion of the market came the division of labor. Men did the fitting, the cutting of the whale fin, and the insertion of the stays into the heavy linen or canvas, which had been stitched by women. An apprenticed boy in stay making had to learn servility, to command his temper, to hold his tongue, and to be very polite. As Paine took up the craft, the corset became the model for the essence of beauty. In his 1753 Analysis of Beauty, the English painter William Hogarth argued that the serpentine line of beauty was the foundation of aesthetics, illustrating his argument with successive images of the corset in profile. The focus was less on the waist than the bosom. In his description of the line of beauty, he did not even include the waist. In 1758, in the 10th edition of his popular Systemus Naturae, Carl Linnaeus defined mammals as possessing mammary glands. Yet hair, the three bones of the ear, or the four-chambered heart would have distinguished mammals from other classes of animals just as well, if not better. In fact, Linnaeus had another agenda. In 1752, he wrote against wet nursing, the practice of putting out infants to nurses of inferior social class, peasants, indigenous people, or Africans, who, it was believed, caused an excess of infant mortality. This was part of a larger state-sponsored policy to restructure childcare and women's lives according to an ideal of domesticity for the demographic purpose of producing a healthy growing population. The veneration of the breast as an ideal of aesthetic beauty and as the scientific criterion for placing Homo sapiens within the animal kingdom served this political purpose. Having finished his apprenticeship, Paine the artisan abandoned his craft. In 1757, he went to sea for 6 months aboard a privateer, the King of Prussia. A study of his sea voyages linking England, America, and France awaits its historian. Months at sea can bring a person to another conception of the terraqueous world. Indeed, Paine worked with people from around the world on board ship. In Rights of Man, he protested the torture of sailors and their impressment. As early as 1745, the New England sailors were being compared to the levelers. 2 years later, Sam Adams wrote that the crowds of sailors opposing impressment embodied the fundamental rights of man. All men are by nature on a level, he explained, born with an equal share of freedom. They assert the right of resistance to oppression, and they assert an axiomatic egalitarianism which Paine summarizes in common sense. Mankind being originally equals in the order of creation. Following his spell at sea, Paine returned to England in 1758. For the next 16 years, he worked variously as a staymaker, school teacher, occasional Methodist preacher, tobacconist, and then as an officer in the excise service, moving from Thetford to Dis, London, Dover, Margate, and Lewes. He was twice married. His first wife died in childbirth, and his second marriage ended amicably in divorce. These were years of intellectual formation without political expression. He began thinking and studying in earnest. In London, he attended scientific lectures, learning techniques of inquiry, investigation, imagination, truth, error. At the Headstrong Club, which met at the White Hart Inn in the Sussex town of Lewes, he practiced declamation and debate on behalf of justice, liberty, and rights. These became elements of his writing style. In Rights of Man, he would praise his own writing for its plain talk, in contrast to Edmund Burke's vapors, romances, and complexities. There is a tendency to say that plain talk arises from plain people, but this need not be the case. Paine's style, straightforward as it may seem, avoids many of the speech communities around him. The slang of the street, the jargon of the trade, the cant of concealment, the dialects of East Anglia, the commoner's nomenclature, Gaelic, the vehicular languages, or pigeon talk of the wharf or the ship's deck are not present directly in his writing. Paine laughs at Burke's argument that hereditary leadership is necessarily wise leadership. To use a sailor's phrase, he has swabbed the deck and scarcely left a name legible on the list of kings. Here, Paine's sense of decorum in 18th century prose requires that he consciously introduces the sailor's language. However, when all is said and done, the source of Paine's eloquence was emancipatory. As John Thelwall, closest of the 1790s radicals to the project of Paine, expressed it, even the popular language of Thomas Paine would not have provoked any very alarming discussion if the general condition of mankind had not predisposed them to exclaim, "We are wretched. Let us inquire the cause." The Case of the Officers of Excise, Paine's first pamphlet, was published in 1772, 1773. Its reasoned arrangement, clarity of address, and collective origins would remain characteristic of his subsequent writings. A petition to the members of Britain's Parliament, it was not published for the general public until 1793. In London, Paine gave a copy to the Irish writer Oliver Goldsmith, author of Gentle Satires on Commercial Society and Privatization of Land. His acclaimed poem, The Deserted Village, had just been published in 1770. Paine's pamphlet is an argument about the wage. As such, it is one of the few of its kind in 18th century England, even though the wage defines the central relationship of capitalism, because it conceals paid from unpaid labor. Writing on behalf of his fellow workers, he provides a variety of arguments in favor of more pay. His first argument was economic. At £50 annual salary for an a £50 annual salary for an excise officer sounds like a lot, but, Paine noted, it amounts actually to 1 shilling 9 pence farthing a day. Taxes, charity, and sitting expenses, horsekeeping, and house rent must all be deducted from the gross amount. Moreover, that amount does not take into account the excessive price of all necessaries of life, the flexibility of money, and the deceptions of the wage removed customary forms of compensation. There are no perquisites or advantages in the least annexed to the employment, such as the cabbage or accompanying benefits Paine would have enjoyed as a staymaker in the tailoring trades. The absence of such perquisites introduced the problem of dishonesty and crime. wages, Paine stated, had replaced commoning. This takes us to his second argument based on religion. He quotes an ancient Hebrew wise man, Augur, who was against class division between rich and poor. The rich person's temptation was to become proud. For the poor, it was to steal. For both, estrangement of the spirit is the result. There is a great gulf fixed, is the scripture of implacable class division. Lazarus, the beggar, was in heaven, and the rich man, Dives, was in hell forever. Paine's third argument is philosophical. A very little degree of that dangerous kind of philosophy, which is the almost certain effect of involuntary poverty, will teach men to believe that to starve is more criminal than to steal. The bread of deceit is a bread of bitterness, but alas, how few in times of want and hardship are capable of thinking so. Objects appear under new colors, and in shapes not naturally their own. Hunger sucks in the deception, and necessity reconciles it to conscience. The sharpness of want overcomes the tenderness of conscience. He concludes on a literary note. But poverty, like grief, has an incurable deafness, which never hears. The oration loses all its edge, and to be or not to be becomes the only question. Paine observed, based on bitter experience, that the office of the exciseman removes them far from all their natural friends and relations, and the occasional assistance, which even the poorest among the poor enjoys. Most poor mechanics or even common laborers have some relations or friends who, either out of benevolence or pride, keep their children from nakedness, supply them occasionally with perhaps half a log, a load of wood, a chaldron of coals. Paine refers to actual commoning as opposed to the theoretical variety. As ever, the commons is best understood not as abstract justice, but as fulfillment of actual need. The criminalization of customary practices and commoning was backed up by the gallows. First-hand experience had taught Paine the evils of wage slavery.